"You're about to hear something that doesn't make sense." The radio crackled, the voice tight, uncertain, cutting through the dry desert air like a blade that didn't belong. And every Marine on range echo froze without knowing why, boots planted in gravel that whispered under shifting weight, the sun hanging high and merciless above them. Heat haze bending the horizon into a shimmering lie as a distant target sat untouched at the far edge of visibility, a full 4,000 meters out, a distance most of them treated like a joke even with top-tier optics and ballistic computers strapped to their wrists. Yet the words lingered, hanging heavier than the heat itself. Impact confirmed, 4,000 meters, and then silence, a deep, unnatural silence that spread across the firing line, swallowing the usual chatter, the metallic clicks, the low hum of equipment, until even the wind seemed to hesitate. Flags that had been snapping all morning suddenly shifting with a strange, uncertain rhythm, as if the air itself had forgotten which direction to move. Gunnery Sergeant Kyle Mercer lowered his binoculars slowly, his jaw tight, eyes narrowing against the glare, scanning the distant ridge again like the answer might appear if he looked hard enough. Because nothing about this added up, not the distance, not the timing, not the fact that 10 minutes ago this entire line had been a mess of missed shots and frustrated Marines relying on technology that kept telling them everything was perfect while reality said otherwise. And somewhere behind them, just at the edge of the firing line where the gravel gave way to packed dirt, stood the old man, still as a fence post, hands resting lightly on a rifle that didn't belong in this place, not with its faded orange coating catching the sunlight in a dull, almost weathered glow, not with its worn stock marked by years that couldn't be measured in service logs or digital records. Ethan Cole hadn't moved when the radio call came in, hadn't flinched, hadn't turned, his pale blue eyes fixed on the horizon as if he had been expecting it all along, as if the distance between him and that target wasn't measured in meters, but in something older, something quieter, something the young Marines around him couldn't see. Mercer's voice broke the silence, low at first, then sharper. "Who took that shot?" But no one answered. Because no one had seen it happen, no one had heard the crack, no one had tracked the trajectory. And that was the part that settled into their bones like a cold weight. Because on a range like this, nothing happened without being seen, without being logged, without being understood. Yet here they were, staring at a confirmed hit that shouldn't exist. The radio hissed again briefly before going dead, leaving only the sound of wind brushing against canvas and the faint rattle of gear shifting against webbing. And somewhere in the back of the formation, Lance Corporal Daniel Brooks felt it first, that quiet, uneasy realization that something was off, not with the shot, but with everything leading up to it, his gaze drifting toward the old man with the orange rifle, toward the way he stood, relaxed but precise, like every inch of his posture had been carved by repetition instead of taught in a classroom. Brooks swallowed, his throat dry despite the heat, because he remembered the way the old man had spoken earlier, calm, almost absent, like he was describing something obvious that no one else could see. "The wind isn't one wind," he had said, and they had laughed, Mercer loudest of all, brushing it off as rambling nonsense from someone who didn't understand modern ballistics. But now, standing in the aftermath of something none of them could explain, that sentence echoed louder than any gunshot. Mercer turned sharply, scanning the line again, frustration bleeding into something closer to disbelief. "I asked a question," he snapped, but even his voice lacked its usual edge, because deep down, he already knew the answer wasn't going to come from any of the Marines under his command, and slowly, almost reluctantly, his eyes shifted toward Ethan Cole, toward that orange rifle that had been the punchline of a dozen jokes not long ago, toward the man who hadn't said a word since. And for the first time since stepping onto that range, Mercer hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, as the wind picked up again, tugging at the flags, changing direction in ways that didn't match the readings on any device. And in that moment, the distance between what they knew and what they had just witnessed stretched wider than the 4,000 meters out in front of them, wide enough to swallow certainty whole. "Run it." Again, Mercer said, but this time his voice was lower, tighter, like he was speaking to the ground instead of the men in front of him. And no one moved at first because there was nothing to run again. No visible shooter, no log shot. No trace in the system that could explain what they had just heard over the radio. The laptops on the folding tables still glowing with perfect green indicators. Every sensor reporting normal conditions. Every calculation insisting that the last 10 minutes had produced nothing but failure. And yet out there, 4,000 meters away, a steel target had been struck with a precision that should not have existed. The wind shifted again, brushing across the range in uneven currents, tugging at sleeves, whispering across gravel. And Daniel Brooks felt it more clearly now. Not just the wind, but the pattern beneath it, the way it changed direction at different distances. Something he had noticed earlier but dismissed because the data on his device told him otherwise. He glanced down at the small screen on his wrist, numbers scrolling, stable, confident, completely wrong. And for the first time since he had earned his place on this range, he did not trust it. Mercer stepped forward, boots crunching hard, scanning the line with a sharp, searching gaze. "I want eyes on every rifle," he said, louder now, forcing control back into his tone. "No one fires unless I say so." But even as he spoke, his attention kept drifting back to the old man, to Ethan Cole, who still had not moved, who still had not spoken, who stood there with that orange rifle resting lightly in his hands like it weighed nothing at all, like it had always belonged there. Brooks swallowed again, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the man more carefully. The way his shoulders were relaxed but aligned, the way his breathing was slow and steady, almost invisible, not the exaggerated control they had been taught, but something deeper, something internal, like he was not controlling his breath so much as existing without disturbing it. Brooks had seen that before, not in training, not in manuals, but in stories, in quiet conversations between older Marines who spoke in half-sentences and unfinished thoughts about men who could read a battlefield without needing a single piece of equipment. Mercer followed Brooks's line of sight and scoffed under his breath, though it lacked conviction. "You think that old man did it," he said, not quite asking, more like trying to dismiss the idea before it took root. Brooks did not answer right away, because the answer felt too heavy, too strange to say out loud. Instead, he watched as Ethan shifted his grip slightly on the rifle, a small adjustment, almost nothing, but precise, deliberate, like the movement of someone who understood every inch of the tool in his hands. Mercer shook his head, louder this time, forcing a laugh that fell flat against the silence. "That rifle is not even zeroed for this range," he said, gesturing toward the faded orange coating. "It is a relic, probably cannot even hold a consistent grouping past 1,000 yards. But even as he spoke, his words sounded rehearsed, like he was repeating something he needed to believe. The wind rolled across the range again, this time from a different angle, subtle but undeniable, and Brooks felt a chill. That had nothing to do with temperature, because he remembered exactly what Ethan had said, not loud, not dramatic, just a simple statement that had been buried under laughter. The wind is not one wind. And now, standing here with flags pulling in opposite directions at different distances, with mirage bending and uneven waves across the heat, Brooks realized that the old man had not been guessing. He had been observing. Mercer took a step closer to Ethan now, closing the distance with a kind of forced authority. "Sir," he said, the word coming out sharper than necessary. "This is a controlled range. If you are going to stand here, you follow protocol." Ethan's eyes shifted slightly, not snapping, not reacting, just moving with a quiet awareness until they met Mercer's. And for a brief moment, Mercer's posture stiffened, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to call out. But Brooks saw it, that tiny hesitation, that fraction of a second where certainty slipped. Ethan did not argue, did not explain. He simply looked past Mercer, back toward the horizon, toward that distant target that none of them could truly see anymore, only trust. And when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, almost absorbed by the wind itself. "Your numbers are correct," he said, and Mercer frowned immediately, ready to respond. But Ethan continued before he could. "They are just not complete." And that was when Brooks felt it fully, the shift, not in the air, not in the range, but in the balance of understanding, like something invisible had tilted just enough for the truth to start showing through. And for the first time, the laughter from earlier felt distant, hollow, like it belonged to a different place, a different moment, one that had already passed without them realizing it. Mercer let out a slow breath through his nose, the kind that carried more frustration than control, and for a moment he said nothing, just stared at Ethan as if waiting for something more, something that would make sense of the calm certainty in his voice. But nothing came, no explanation, no elaboration, just that same quiet presence that seemed to settle heavier with every passing second. And it irritated him more than any open defiance ever could. Not complete, Mercer repeated under his breath, like the words themselves were something he could break apart if he said them enough times. Then louder, sharper. We have wind readings, temperature, barometric pressure, everything accounted for. He gestured toward the equipment laid out behind him, screens glowing, numbers steady. There is nothing incomplete about it. But even as he spoke, a gust moved across the range from right to left, tugging at the nearest flag while another, farther out, barely shifted at all, and beyond. That, near the ridge, the mirage twisted in a different direction entirely, heat waves bending light in subtle layers that refused to align. Brooks saw it clearly now, not as random movement, but as separate currents existing at the same time, stacked across distance like invisible roads crossing each other. And suddenly Ethan's words did not sound strange anymore. They sounded precise. Mercer followed the motion of the flags, his eyes narrowing, and for a fraction of a second, doubt crept in. Small but undeniable. He turned back quickly, shaking it off. Even if that were true, he said, forcing his tone back into command. No one here can calculate that in real time without proper input. Ethan shifted slightly, adjusting the rifle in his hands, the orange coating catching the sunlight again, worn in places where fingers had rested thousands of times before. The stock bearing faint marks that told a story no system could log. He ran his thumb lightly along one of those marks, almost absent, almost unconscious, and for a brief instant, the world around him seemed to fall away, the dry desert air replaced by something thicker, heavier, the distant ridge no longer empty but alive with shapes and shadows that only memory could supply, the sound of wind replaced by something deeper, a layered hum of movement and distance, not loud, not chaotic, just present, like a pattern that had once been learned the hard way and never forgotten. Brooks noticed the change first, not in what Ethan did, but in how still he became, the kind of stillness that was not passive, but focused, like everything unnecessary had been stripped away. Mercer noticed it too, though he did not understand it, and that unsettled him more than anything else. Sir, he said again, this time slower, as if choosing his words more carefully. If you are implying that you can read all of that without instrumentation, I would like to see it. The challenge hung in the air, not loud, not dramatic, but heavy, and for a moment, no one spoke. The Marines along the line shifted slightly, attention pulling tighter, conversations dying completely as the weight of the moment settled in. Ethan lifted his gaze from the rifle to the horizon once more, his eyes tracing something no one else could follow, and when he spoke, it was barely above the sound of the wind. You already did, he said. Mercer frowned immediately, confusion flashing across his face. What is that supposed to mean? He asked, sharper now, but Ethan did not look at him, did not react to the tone. He simply watched the distance. The shot, he said quietly. You heard it. And that was when it landed, not like a sudden realization, but like something slowly locking into place. Brooks felt it first, the connection forming between the impossible call over the radio and the man standing in front of them, his chest tightening slightly as the pieces aligned in a way that could not be undone. Mercer's expression hardened, resistance rising against the implication. That was not you, he said quickly, almost too quickly. No one here fired. But even as he said it, his eyes flicked to the rifle again, to the way Ethan held it, not loosely, not casually, but with a familiarity that ran deeper than training. The wind shifted again, a low, steady push from behind them now, different from before, changing the feel of the air just enough to notice if you were paying attention. And Ethan finally moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a small, deliberate step forward onto the firing line, gravel crunching softly beneath his boots, and for the first time since he had arrived, every Marine on that range was watching him, not with amusement, not with dismissal, but with something else entirely. Something quieter, something that had begun to replace certainty with doubt. And Mercer, standing just a few feet away, felt it too, whether he wanted to or not, as the balance continued to shift in a direction none of them could control. The sound of gravel under Ethan's boots was soft, almost lost beneath the steady whisper of wind, but it carried farther than it should have, reaching every Marine on the line as if the range itself had gone quiet just to hear it. Mercer did not step aside immediately, his body holding position out of instinct more than intention, the last thin thread of authority pulling against something he could not quite name. But Ethan did not stop, did not slow, and without a word Mercer shifted half a step to the side, just enough to clear the lane. A movement so small it might have gone unnoticed if not for the weight behind it. Brooks caught it, felt it settle in his chest like a marker being placed. Something had just changed, not loudly, not officially, but undeniably. Ethan moved into position with no urgency, no hesitation, setting the rifle down against his shoulder with a familiarity that erased the distance between man and machine. His hands did not fumble, did not adjust more than necessary. Everything was already where it needed to be. The orange finish of the rifle dull under the sun, worn smooth in places where time had passed over it again and again. Mercer crossed his arms, forcing a steady posture. "You are not cleared to fire," he said. But the words lacked the edge they had carried earlier, and Ethan did not respond. He simply looked out across the range, eyes narrowing slightly, as if focusing on something no one else could see. Brooks followed his gaze, trying to find the same point, but all he saw was distance, heat, and a target that blurred into the horizon. The wind shifted again, this time brushing across Ethan's left side, then rolling forward in a slow, uneven push. The flags reacted differently, one snapping sharp, another barely moving, and beyond them the mirage twisted in layered currents that bent the air into something almost liquid. Ethan inhaled slowly, not deep, not exaggerated, just enough, and then let it settle. His breathing disappearing into the stillness of his frame. Mercer opened his mouth again, ready to repeat the order, but something stopped him, something subtle and unfamiliar. Like interrupting now would be stepping into a process he did not understand. Brooks felt it too. The sense that whatever was happening was already in motion, already past the point where commands mattered. Ethan's finger rested alongside the trigger, not tense, not ready, just there, waiting, his other hand steady along the stock, thumb brushing lightly against a faint groove worn into the wood. And for a brief moment, his gaze softened, not losing focus, but shifting inward, as if the distance in front of him was no longer measured in yards but in memory. The desert air faded at the edges, replaced by something older, something carried forward through years that had not erased it. The sound of wind became layered, not just what was happening now, but what had happened before. Patterns repeating across time in ways that could not be taught, only learned. Brooks felt a chill despite the heat, because he realized Ethan was not calculating. He was recognizing. Mercer shifted his weight slightly, the tension in his stance tightening. His eyes locked on the rifle, on the man holding it, trying to find something that would make sense, some flaw, some hesitation. But there was none, only that same quiet certainty that had been there from the beginning. Ethan exhaled slowly. The movement so slight it barely disturbed the air around him. And in that moment, everything seemed to align. The wind, the flags, the shimmer of heat across the ground, all of it settling into a pattern that existed for only a fraction of a second. And Ethan saw it, not as a collection of variables, but as a single path stretching from where he stood to a point no one else could truly see. Mercer's voice came out again, softer this time, almost unwilling. "That distance is not possible." But the words felt hollow even as he said them, because possibility had already begun to shift. Brooks held his breath without realizing it, every sense pulling tight, waiting, the range silent except for the low hum of wind moving across uneven ground. And Ethan, without changing expression, without acknowledging anyone around him, made the smallest movement of all, the kind that could be missed if you blinked. A subtle pressure, a controlled release, not forceful, not dramatic, just precise. And then he was still again, exactly as he had been before, the rifle steady, his posture unchanged, no follow-through exaggerated, no reaction to mark the moment, just silence, a long, stretching silence that settled over the range like a held breath. Mercer blinked once, then again, his eyes flicking toward the distant ridge, waiting for something, anything. But nothing came, no visible impact, no immediate confirmation, just distance and heat, and the quiet realization that whatever had just happened, they would not understand it right away, and somewhere behind them, the radio remained silent for now. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected, long enough for doubt to creep back in, long enough for Mercer's jaw to tighten again as if reality might correct itself if given enough time. He exhaled sharply and shook his head once, a short, dismissive motion that tried to reclaim control. There it is, he muttered under his breath, louder now as he straightened. No impact, no confirmation, his voice gaining strength with each word, feeding on the absence of immediate proof. That is, what happens when you guess at distances you cannot verify. A few of the Marines shifted slightly, the tension easing just enough for uncertainty to slip back into something familiar, something safe. Brooks did not move, did not speak, his eyes still fixed on Ethan, because the old man had not changed, not even slightly. He stood exactly as before, rifle steady, posture relaxed, gaze still on the horizon as if the outcome had already been decided and there was no need to check it twice. The wind brushed across the range again, softer now, almost steady, the flags settling into a pattern that seemed calmer than before, and Brooks felt it, that same quiet certainty returning, not from data, not from confirmation, but from the man standing a few feet ahead of him. Mercer turned away, slightly, gesturing toward the equipment behind him. Reset the targets, he called out, already moving on, already dismissing what he could not immediately prove. But before anyone could respond, the radio cracked to life, sudden and sharp, cutting through the air with a burst of static that snapped every head back toward it. The voice that followed was controlled, but there was something underneath it, something tight, something that did not belong to routine communication. Range echo. Confirm last shot, the voice said, and Mercer froze mid-step, his body locking in place before he could stop it. Brooks felt his chest tighten as the seconds stretched. The radio hissed again. Then the same voice returned, slower this time, each word deliberate. We have impact. Repeat. Confirmed impact. 4,032 meters. And just like that, the air changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. The kind of shift that settles into the ground beneath your feet before you even realize it has happened. Mercer did not speak, did not move, his eyes fixed forward as if refusing to accept what he had just heard. Brooks felt it ripple through the line. The Marines around him going still, conversations gone, movement gone, replaced by something heavier, something that pushed down on the moment and held it there. The impossible had just been spoken into reality, and no one knew what to do with it. The radio remained open for a second longer, then the voice came back. Again, quieter now, but sharper in a different way. Stand by, it said, and then it went silent, leaving behind a void that felt louder than any noise. Mercer slowly turned his head, his gaze drifting back toward Ethan, and this time there was no dismissal in it, no immediate explanation, only a question he could not form into words. Ethan lowered the rifle slightly, not in triumph, not in acknowledgement, just a simple movement as if the task had been completed and there was nothing more to add. Brooks watched him carefully, searching for some reaction, some sign that this moment mattered to him. But there was none, only that same quiet stillness, like the distance he had just bridged meant nothing more than what it was. The wind shifted again, gently now, almost steady, and for the first time since the shot, it felt predictable, understandable, as if the chaos from before had resolved itself after being seen for what it truly was. Mercer finally spoke, but his voice had changed, lower, stripped of its earlier certainty. That is not possible, he said, but the words did not carry the same weight anymore. They sounded smaller, like something set out of habit rather than belief. Brooks glanced down at his device again. The numbers still steady, still confident, still incomplete. And he realized then that nothing on that screen could explain what had just happened, because it had not been about calculation. It had been about something else entirely, something that could not be programmed or taught in the way they had been taught to learn. Mercer took a slow step forward, then another, stopping a few feet from Ethan, the distance between them no longer defined by rank or authority, but by understanding or the lack of it. And for the first time since this began, Mercer did not issue an order, did not correct, did not dismiss. He just stood there, looking at the man in front of him as if seeing him clearly for the first time. And somewhere in the background, beyond the range, beyond the heat and the horizon, something else had already begun to move, something that had heard the same confirmation and reacted in a way none of them could yet see. The radio's silence did not last long enough to be comfortable, and when it broke again, it did not come with uncertainty this time. It came with urgency, the kind that moved faster than explanation. Range echo, hold position. The voice said, sharper now, layered with something that did not belong to routine protocol. Mercer's head tilted slightly toward the speaker, his expression tightening as he listened. The shift in tone registering before the meaning fully formed. Brooks felt it too. That subtle escalation. Like the air had changed direction again, but this time it was not the wind. It was something higher, something moving through channels none of them could see. Repeat. Hold position. Do not reset targets. The radio continued, and that alone was enough to lock everyone in place. Because targets were always reset, data was always cleared, but not now. Not after that shot. Mercer straightened instinctively, his posture snapping back into something closer to formal, though the confidence behind it had thinned. This is Gunnery Sergeant. Mercer, he responded, voice controlled but no longer dismissive. Confirm instructions. A brief pause followed, just long enough to stretch tension across the line again. Then the reply came, lower, deliberate. Command has been notified. And that was when it settled fully, not just into Mercer, not just into Brooks, but into every Marine standing there. This was no longer a range anomaly. This had moved beyond them. Mercer's jaw tightened as he lowered the radio slightly, his eyes drifting. Once more to Ethan, and this time there was no attempt to challenge, no immediate dismissal. Only a measured silence that spoke louder than anything he could have said earlier. Brooks shifted his weight subtly, his attention sharpening as pieces began to connect in a way that felt larger than the moment itself. He had seen reactions like this before, not often, but enough to recognize the pattern. Something had triggered a chain above their level, something that did not get ignored. The wind rolled across the range again, steady now, almost calm, as if the chaos from earlier had been replaced by a quiet expectation. Ethan remained exactly where he was, the rifle lowered slightly, his posture unchanged, his gaze no longer fixed on the distant target, but resting somewhere between here and there, like the outcome had already been filed away in his mind. Mercer took a slow step closer, not aggressive, not confrontational, just closing the space with a kind of cautious respect he would not have admitted even seconds ago. Who are you? He asked finally, the question coming out quieter than intended, stripped of rank, stripped of command. Just a man asking another man for something real. Ethan did not answer right away, his eyes shifting briefly toward Mercer, then back to the horizon. And for a moment it seemed like he might not answer at all. But then he spoke, his voice low, steady. Just someone who learned to listen. Mercer frowned slightly, the simplicity of the answer. Offering nothing he could hold on to. Nothing he could file into understanding. Brooks watched the exchange closely, feeling the gap widen between what they knew and what they were witnessing. The radio crackled again, this time louder, more direct. Range echo, be advised. Incoming command transport. The words landed with a weight that changed everything again. Mercer's posture straightened fully now. Instinct overriding confusion as protocol took hold. Copy, he responded immediately. Though his eyes never left Ethan for more than a second, Brooks felt his pulse pick up slightly. Not from fear, but from anticipation, because now the pattern was complete. The shot, the confirmation, the escalation, and now the arrival. Something was coming to meet what had just happened, and it was not coming quietly. The distant sound reached them moments later, faint at first, then growing, a low, rhythmic hum cutting through the desert air, not loud enough to dominate, but steady enough to command attention. Every head turned slightly toward the source, eyes scanning the horizon beyond the range. The sound of rotor blades became clearer with each passing second, slicing through the heat with a controlled, deliberate rhythm. Mercer exhaled slowly, his earlier certainty gone, replaced by something else entirely, something closer to realization. Brooks glanced back at Ethan one more time, expecting some reaction to the incoming presence. But there was none, no surprise, no tension, just that same quiet stillness, as if this, too, had already been accounted for, as if the distance between a shot and what followed after it had always been part of the same path. And as the helicopter drew closer, casting a shifting shadow across the far edge of the range, the balance that had been tilting since the first radio call finally settled into place, not in their favor, not in anyone's control, but exactly where it was always meant to land. The helicopter did not rush in. It approached with controlled precision, descending from the horizon like something that already knew exactly where it needed to be. The rhythmic thump of its blades cutting through the desert air in steady intervals that seemed to press down on the range with every rotation. Dust began to lift along the outer edges of the training ground, curling low across the gravel in thin, shifting sheets. Marines instinctively squared their stance, boots firm, eyes tracking the aircraft as it closed the distance. Mercer did not give the order to stand at attention. He did not need to. The presence of the incoming command had already done that for him. Brooks felt it settle into his posture before he even realized he had adjusted, shoulders back, chin slightly raised, not out of ceremony but out of instinct, because whatever was about to step off that aircraft was not arriving casually. The helicopter touched down just beyond the range boundary, its landing precise, controlled, the engine remaining active as the rotor wash continued to push air across the ground in powerful waves, flattening loose debris, tugging at uniforms. And yet through all of it, Ethan Cole did not move. He stood exactly as he had before, unaffected by the noise, the wind, or the shift in atmosphere. As if the arrival had nothing to do with him at all, the side door of the helicopter opened with a sharp motion, and for a brief second there was only shadow inside. Then a figure stepped out, tall, composed, his uniform crisp despite the environment, rank visible even from a distance, and the effect was immediate. Mercer's posture locked fully into formality now, his earlier hesitation replaced by the automatic response drilled into him over years of service. Brooks felt the same shift ripple through the line, every Marine aligning without command, the quiet tension, replaced by structured stillness. The officer moved forward without hesitation, boots striking the ground with measured confidence, his gaze already scanning the range before he had even cleared the rotor wash. And then it settled, directly on Ethan, not on Mercer, not on the line, but on the man standing alone with the orange rifle. And something in that look changed the air again. Not louder, not more intense, but deeper, like a recognition that did not need confirmation. Mercer stepped forward now, voice firm, controlled. "Sir," he began, but the officer raised a hand slightly, not abruptly, just enough to pause him, and Mercer stopped mid-word, the interruption absolute without being forceful. The officer continued walking, closing the distance with Ethan, each step deliberate, each movement carrying a weight that did not come from rank alone. Brooks watched closely, his attention locked onto the interaction, because this was the moment everything had been building toward. The shot, the confirmation, the call, the arrival, all of it leading here. The officer stopped a few feet in front of Ethan, the rotor wash still pushing at their uniforms, the sound of the helicopter steady behind them. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them different from before, not uncertain, not tense, but filled with something older, something understood without explanation. The officer's eyes moved briefly to the rifle, to the worn orange finish, to the faint markings along the stock, and then back to Ethan's face. And when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, carrying easily despite the noise around them. "I was told the shot came from this line," he said, not a question, not a demand, just a statement placed carefully into the moment. Ethan met his gaze without hesitation, without change in expression. "It did," he replied, simple, direct. The officer held his gaze for a second longer, then gave a small nod, not formal, not ceremonial, just acknowledgement. Mercer stood just behind them, listening, watching, his earlier certainty now fully replaced by something else, something closer to understanding, but not quite there yet. Brooks felt it too, that quiet shift, because whatever this was, it was not about proving anything anymore. It was about recognizing something that had already been proven. The officer took a slow breath, his posture easing slightly, not losing authority, but changing its weight. And then he spoke again, softer this time, almost reflective. "For 1,000 meters," he said, the number hanging in the air like something that needed no explanation, and Ethan did not respond. He did not confirm. He did not deny. He simply stood there, the wind moving gently now, the chaos from before replaced by a steady calm, and in that stillness, the difference between what had been believed and what had just been witnessed settled fully into place, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. The officer's gaze did not leave Ethan, and for a moment the rest of the range seemed to fade into the background, the Marines standing in silent formation, the helicopter idling behind them, the wind moving steadily across the open ground, all of it becoming secondary to the quiet exchange taking place at the center of it all. The officer shifted his stance slightly, not in discomfort, but in recognition. As if adjusting to something that did not fit within standard protocol, his eyes moved again to the rifle, lingering this time on the faded orange finish, on the way the color had worn unevenly along the edges, revealing layers beneath that spoke of years rather than design. And something in his expression changed, subtle but unmistakable, like a memory had surfaced, not fully formed, but enough to alter the way he looked at it. Focus, the pause that carried meaning he could not yet understand. Brooks saw it too, felt it settle into the moment like a missing piece sliding into place. The officer stepped closer now, just enough to narrow the space between them, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different tone, less formal, more deliberate. "That rifle," he said, not as a question, but as something being confirmed internally. Ethan followed his gaze briefly, then returned his eyes forward, his expression unchanged. "It has been with me a long time," he replied, simple, without weight, but the officer gave a faint nod, as if that was exactly what he expected to hear. Mercer shifted slightly behind them, the tension in his stance tightening again, not from authority this time, but from the realization that he was no longer the one guiding this interaction. Brooks felt it as well, the sense that they were witnessing something that existed outside of their training, outside of their understanding. The officer exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing just a fraction, and then he reached out, not abruptly, not without care, but with a deliberate motion toward the rifle, stopping just short of touching it, his hand hovering for a brief second as if the distance itself mattered, then lowering it again without contact, a decision made without words. He looked back at Ethan, his eyes steady, and this time when he spoke, there was no ambiguity left in his tone. "We used to mark them like that," he said quietly, the words carrying through the air with a clarity that cut deeper than volume ever could. Mercer frowned slightly, confusion tightening his features. Brooks leaned forward just enough to catch every word. The officer continued, his voice calm, reflective, not for identification, not for inventory. He paused briefly, the wind brushing across the range in a steady, even flow now, for safety. Ethan gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, but enough, and that was when the understanding began to form, not fully, not all at once, but in pieces. Mercer's eyes shifted from the rifle to the officer, then back again, the earlier laughter echoing faintly in his memory, now stripped of its certainty. Brooks felt it more clearly, the connection between the color, the distance, the shot, and the reaction they were witnessing. The officer took another slow breath, then spoke again, softer. "Now, but heavier, so your own men would know," he said, the sentence unfinished but complete in meaning. Ethan's gaze remained steady, fixed somewhere beyond the range, beyond the moment, and for a brief second, the desert air seemed to carry something older, something not visible but present, like a memory passing through without needing to be spoken. Mercer lowered his eyes slightly, the weight of what he had dismissed settling in a way he could not ignore anymore. Brooks felt a quiet shift in his chest, not shock, not disbelief, but recognition. The kind that came when something finally made sense in a way that could not be undone. The officer straightened slightly, his posture returning to form, but the tone had changed, the authority still there, but no longer distant, no longer detached. He looked at Ethan one more time, then gave a single, deliberate nod, not as an order, not as acknowledgement of rank, but as something else entirely, something closer to respect, and behind them, the rotor blades continued their steady rhythm. The wind moved evenly across the range, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was understood. The nod did not end the moment. It settled it, like a final piece placed exactly where it had always belonged. And for a few seconds no one moved. Not Mercer, not Brooks, not a single Marine along the line. Because there was nothing left to question, nothing left to challenge, only something to absorb. The officer stepped back half a pace, not retreating, not disengaging, just allowing space to exist again between them. And in that space the weight of what had happened spread quietly across the range. Mercer inhaled slowly, his chest rising under the fabric of his uniform as he looked once more at Ethan, not searching for flaws anymore, not trying to reconcile what he had seen with what he had been taught, but simply looking, really looking, as if the man in front of him had finally come into focus after being overlooked in plain sight. Brooks felt it too, the shift from confusion to something steadier, something that did not need explanation to be real. The helicopter continued its steady rhythm behind them, the sound now blending into the background like a constant reminder that something larger had acknowledged this moment and then chosen not to interrupt it further. The officer turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the line of Marines, not sharply, not critically, but with a quiet awareness that carried its own message, and one by one, without command, without instruction, they adjusted, posture straightening not out of obligation but out of understanding. Mercer's shoulders squared fully now, but not in the rigid way from before. This time it carried a different weight, something earned rather than enforced. He glanced briefly at the rifle again, at the worn orange finish that had been the source of laughter not long ago, and the memory of that laughter felt distant, misplaced, like it belonged to a version of himself that had not yet seen what was possible. Brooks lowered his gaze for a moment, then lifted it again, his eyes settling on Ethan with a quiet respect that did not need to be spoken. The officer stepped back another pace, then brought his hand up in a precise, controlled motion, not exaggerated, not performative, just exact, and held it there, a salute, clean and deliberate, offered not to rank, not to position, but to something else entirely, something that existed outside of formal structure. Mercer saw it and reacted without thinking, his own hand rising in the same motion, followed by Brooks, followed by every Marine on that line, the movement spreading in perfect silence until the entire range stood in still formation, hands raised, eyes forward, no commands given, no orders required, just a shared understanding that had formed in the space between a single shot and everything that came after it. Ethan did not react immediately. He did not snap into position, did not mirror the gesture with urgency. He simply stood there for a brief second longer, as if acknowledging the moment in his own way. Then slowly, deliberately, he lifted his hand and returned the salute. Not sharp, not rigid, but steady, grounded, and complete. The wind moved gently across the range, the flags now aligned in a single, consistent direction, the chaos from before gone, replaced by a calm that felt earned rather than given. The officer lowered his hand first, followed by Mercer, then Brooks, then the rest, the motion ending as quietly as it began. And for a moment longer, no one spoke, because there was nothing that needed to be said. The distance had already been measured, not in meters, not in numbers, but in understanding. Ethan lowered his hand and shifted the rifle slightly, resting it against his side, his gaze drifting once more toward the horizon, as if the range in front of him was no longer the point, as if it had never been. The officer watched him for a second longer, then gave a final nod, smaller this time, almost personal, before turning back toward the waiting helicopter. Mercer stepped aside instinctively, clearing the path without being told. Brooks remained still, his eyes following Ethan as the old man began to walk away from the firing line. Not hurried, not slow, just steady, his figure moving across the gravel with the same quiet presence he had carried from the beginning. And as he reached the edge of the range, he did not look back, did not pause. He simply continued forward, leaving behind a silence that no longer felt empty, but full. And in that silence, something settled into every man standing there, something that would not be forgotten, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was real. And as the helicopter lifted back into the sky, the wind rising gently beneath it, the range returned to stillness, but not the same stillness as before. This one carried weight, carried memory, and somewhere in that quiet, without being spoken, the truth remained. Respect is not claimed, it is recognized when it can no longer be denied.